Welcome.
Great. Good evening. So, thank you for the invitation for share have some such song with you all, and engage our minds in thinking about ancient Indian civilization, about which we're primarily interested in, of course, devotees of Krishna are primarily interested in Krishna's situation within that civilization. But I think the format's going to be the questions, right? Did we Sarvabhauma Prabhu, did we not
yes,
agree that you were just going to shoot some questions at me and just spontaneously?
Yes, I think that'd be nice.
Yeah.
So I understand you got connected to India or interested in India from a very young age, and you're teaching about India in college, which I think is wonderful and rare that people are teaching what they love and enjoy. So how did you get interested in India in the first place?
You know, who knows? I was very young, so from the point of view of yoga psychology, it could very well have been, the reawakening of past life samskaras, because way before I knew anything about Indian philosophy, I was always just fascinated and attracted to India. And as soon as I could, I was one of those characters that hitchhiked to India in the late 70s, when you could still do that overland. And I knew nothing of Krishna. I knew nothing of Vrindavan. I was just, as I say, hitchhiked across Asia. Took a couple of years and eventually came into Northwest India. And just fortuitously, from my point of view, as a complete accident, I happened to get off the train at Mathura and somehow got on this bus, and I had no idea where it was going, which ended up in Vrindavan. So I would like to think that Sri Krishna called me, even though I knew nothing about, Gaudiya Vaishnavism, nothing about Vrindavan at the time. I was actually following up a Buddhist path, but without great conviction. But nonetheless, I was sort of nominally associated with the Buddhist path. So that's how I ended up in Vrindavan, and I spent a few years there in the late 70s and early 80s. So I became very deeply immersed and embedded in Indian culture and philosophy and practices, became a bhakta. And eventually, when I came back to the West, because I got fairly ill at a certain point, I decided I would enter academia as a good way of continuing my studies, with a view to sort of supporting myself eventually, perhaps. And that's how I ended up getting a PhD. And then I didn't actually imagine I was actually going to get an academic job or pursue an academic career, but somehow the doors opened, Sarvabhauma, by the grace of Ishvara, and here we are, discussing topics dear to our hearts. And so now it's been 40-something years. And I think you too look like you have been around many years in devotional circles. Are you? What is your story?
I was a wrestler in high school and college.
Oh.
And my brother got into meditation, transcendental meditation, so I got into that. I became a vegetarian from that while I was still wrestling. And then I became a meditation teacher. And I was a little bored with the philosophy, because the Maharishi would have a flower and say that the sap it's nothing but sap. It's sap in the stems, sap in the the petals of the flower, and the philosophy wasn't so exciting, but I liked the process, and it got me introduced to Indian philosophy and the Bhagavad Gita. And then my high school wrestling coach later gave me Bhagavad Gita as it is. And it turned out that at one seminar in Switzerland, they had TM movement had the cloth-bound Gita Press Bhagavatam 2-volume available for reading in his free time.
Oh.
So I picked it up for the first time and just opened one of the volumes. And by coincidence, Chanur and Mustika were speaking to Krishna. They had just challenged him to a wrestling or fighting. And Krishna had said, "You're too big and strong." And they said, "Well, you killed the elephant this morning, so I think it was a fair match." So I was blown away by that. And later I got involved in Krishna consciousness. And I read the Bhagavatam also. So
here you are.
I wanted to ask you, the topic that I was interested in exploring was the glory and the paradoxes of India. So I'd like to hear from you some of the glorious aspects of India. Like I've thought of certain areas, like the principle of ahimsa is very strong in Indian culture. Both the Jain tradition, the Hindu tradition, the Buddhist tradition, they have different ideas of non-harm. But it seems to me a very glorious thing that India has this amazing tradition of non-harm. Could you speak on that a bit?
Yeah, the 5 yamas that nowadays in the yoga world is associated with Patanjali's Yoga Sutras, the 5 yamas, which are the first limb of the eightfold limbs of yoga, which are pretty much at the core of a lot of most Indian soteriological, and that's a word we use in academia to mean tradition that aspires for liberation. And the core practice in many of the traditions, even the Bhagavatam, we find a sort of the Bhagavatam version of the 8th form limb of yoga. We see it described in several places. And there may be some variations, between how some of the limbs have slightly different names and different traditions. But they all seem to include the yamas and the yamas especially. In the first yama, the yamas meaning the sort of restrictions, observances from the 8 limbs. The first of the yamas, and there's 5 yamas, and the first of these is ahimsa, non-violence. And in Indian literary protocol, the first item on a list is typically the most important. If there's a list, you're going to put the most important item first. And we even have that in English. If we have a list of things, for example, a list of names of people, we tend to put the most important first. So that's certainly the case in Indian literary protocols. So the very first of the 8 limbs is the yama, and the very first of the yamas is ahimsa. So we could say that ahimsa is the first religious principle, and often considered to be the sort of founding stone of everything else. So, and these yamas are not sect specific. The Jains have exactly the same 5 yamas, and the Buddhists have 4 out of the 5. They add the 5th one. Instead of having, they have non-intoxication as their 5th, which is not present in the other list. But nonetheless, ahimsa is there as the first of this list. So we could say pretty much it's the first step into a spiritual life. Okay, yoga being that which takes us to our obviously very different kinds of yoga, but classical generic yoga is that which takes us to the Atman. Of course, Bhakti yoga is that which takes us to Bhagavan. But even then, preliminary to even a Bhakti yoga is the idea that we are Atman. That's why it's the first teaching of the Gita. Before the Gita gets into Bhakti, it first establishes the Atman in chapter 2. Okay, and the first step in the first step towards striving to seek that Atman, first Yamah, is ahimsa, non-violence. And this, in the commentaries of the Yoga Sutras, because when you read texts in classical India, whether sutra texts especially, but also the Bhagavatam, by the way, you'd always read it with commentary. For example, Prabhupada has his commentaries, and in this way he follows the tradition of exegesis. Exegesis is how you interpret sacred texts. So Prabhupada is continuing that exegetical tradition by writing his commentaries. Right. So ahimsa then, first step in any form of spiritual practice, Jain, Buddhist, any of the Vedic traditions, and even right-handed tantra. Not left-handed, but right-handed tantra, which is more of a marginal tradition. And ahimsa reflects, it's a moral principle, it's a yogic principle, but it also reflects a deep jnana-based principle. And that jnana-based principle is that not only are we Atman, and yoga is the process that takes us to our Atman, but all embodied beings are Atmans. So animals are also Atmans. The only difference, then there's no difference in the Atman of the animal and the Atman of the here. Here we differ from the Western traditions. Western notions of the soul are, many of them, including Christian ones, are based on Plato. And Plato's idea of the soul, the psyche, he considered there were three types: the vegetative soul, the animal soul, and then the rational soul, which would be the human soul. And so therefore, if you lessen the reality of these other souls, you lessen their worth vis-a-vis the human rational soul. If you a priori lessen the value of the animal soul by positing that it has a different kind of soul and the plant a different kind again, then obviously you're opening up a door for the exploitation of souls in animal bodies, because their souls are different from humans, and therefore they are fit objects of consumption. But in the Indian point of view, and here we can also include Buddhism and Jainism, even though they have different notions of what the self is, they all agree that whatever that self is, Buddhists have their own way of construing it. It's the same self in the body of an animal as in the body of a human, and of course that we can extend that. It's the same in the body of a plant. But at that point, then, certainly Hindus and Buddhists draw the line that it's okay to eat plants because those souls are in such tamasic bodies that the tamas is so prevalent. They only have one sense. Plants only have one sense. They don't see, they don't hear, they don't smell, they can't taste. They can only feel. They can feel the sun. Those animals have all five senses and highly evolved nervous system. So therefore experience pain. Because plants barely experience any pain. And even then, bhaktas take the view that even with plants, we should offer it first to God, because otherwise there is some minor ahimsa or violence even with the vegetarian diet. But let's bracket that and go back to your point. So one of the glories, I don't know if that's, if we use that word glories, but I think of one of these sort of great spiritual realizations of Indian thinkers. One of these sort of wisdom, one of the great features of Indian wisdom was this recognition that animals, in their deepest level, are Atmans the same as we are, and they suffer the same as we suffer. And of course, the Jains have taken this even further than the Hindu traditions have. The Jains, in extreme forms of Jainism, Jains will sweep the road. I mean, they're famous for sweeping the road to make sure that they don't step on any ants, and they have a much stricter manner of living so as to minimize any possible ahimsa or violence against other embodied beings. So yes, this idea of non-violence is the first principle, and the commentators of the Yoga Sutra, the yoga tradition, say if there's ever a conflict between yamas, ahimsa always has to be honored first. For example, the second yama is satyam, truthfulness. So if there's ever a conflict between non-violence and truthfulness, non-violence should always trump, should always come out ahead, should always trump truthfulness. So it is the foundation of Hindu ethics and morality. It is the support of all the other yamas. One commentator says it's like the elephant's hoof, which encompasses all of the footprints of any other creature, is contained within it. It isn't just physical, it's also mental and verbal. Non-violence, I mean, one could revolve one's entire spiritual practice simply around deepening one's understanding of what non-violence is. It's not just physical aggression. It's subtle tone of voice, even just even a mental vritti, a mental thought can be picked up by another person. That what in the 60s we would call vibes. All of that can be included in this category of ahimsa. So by situating ahimsa as the foundation of all morality, yes, I think that's glorious. And I think that one can definitely identify that as one of the great, profound insights and practices and tenets of ancient India. And it's in the decline. When I went to India, 60% of Indians were vegetarians. It's now down to 40%. That's in my lifetime. We talk about we talk about Kali Yuga and the decline, the civilizational decline of inherent and cyclical time. I mean, and one might say that's mythical or that's mythological. But in my life, I went to India in the late 70s. At that time, there was 60% of the country was vegetarian. And in my one lifetime, in 40-something years, it's 20%, it's gone down 20% from 60 to 40%. So if we want to talk about the decrease of dharma in the age of Kali, or we can talk about the mythic past, we can talk about, Parikshit and the bull, or we can just quote statistics from our very own reality, such as the one I just quoted, in terms of the statistically documented decline in the notions of ahimsa as represented in vegetarianism in India within our own lifetimes.
Thank you. That's nice. I was quite struck when Srila Prabhupada gave the idea that violence is also not giving Krishna consciousness to someone. That seems like a very brilliant and amazing.
And obviously Srila Prabhupada was a very advanced, devotee of Lord Krishna. He saw Krishna everywhere. He saw all problems in the world as stemming from a disconnect with Krishna. He saw all suffering in the world as being a result of that disconnect with Krishna, and therefore ultimate philanthropy, ultimate welfare work was to give people Krishna. And you could frame that in the way you just did, which is if you don't do that, so indirectly, from his point of view, that could be construed as a type of ahimsa, because you're depriving a person the chance to embark on a spiritual life. And so obviously, preaching was central to Prabhupada's mission. Perhaps, some of his disciples in the early days took that a little bit too enthusiastically and to extremes that were perhaps reflected immaturity of the time. All of that's fair enough and understandable. Devotees were young. They just come off the streets as hippies. And we can say perhaps in the early days there was a bit of extra zealousness, maybe overzealousness. But the basic principle of presenting these teachings to the world in a discreet, non-dogmatic sort of way, it can definitely be seen as the ultimate welfare work.
I wanted to ask you about, I was amazed to see some statistics or some estimates by some scholars about the quantity of handwritten manuscripts in India before the printing press compared to Greek and Latin manuscripts. There's something like 30 times more in India, or even higher estimates from some other scholars. So India was amazingly literate. Ancient India was amazingly literate civilization. Can you comment on that?
Yeah, we can say that. I mean, I've read that there was more. There's up until the arrival of the printing press, there was more written in Sanskrit than any other literary tradition of the world put together. But let's be also mindful of the fact that literality was pretty much the prerogative of the Brahmanic caste. It wasn't widespread. So the kind of the India that we know, when we think of glorious India and wonderful India and ancient India, it's really the India of the Brahmins and the Kshatriyas. When you read the Mahabharata, you read the Bhagavata Purana, let's just stick with the Bhagavata Purana, which is the canonical text of the Krishna tradition, there's very little information about the reality of Sudras, the life of the Sudras, the 95% of the population that are working in the fields, that are growing rice, that are growing wheat. We get no sense at all of what their existence was like, or even the Vaishyas. So the texts reflect the stories of the ideal Brahmins and the ideal kings. So we get an ideal there of what that should look like. And certainly then, there was writing, but that would not have been widespread. That would have been the preserve of a tiny handful of Brahmins, and probably a lot of the manuscripts are sponsored by kings and courts, royal courts. There may have been monasteries too, or mats. Certainly Buddhism there was. So it's, when we think of Jiva Goswami, Rupa Goswami, scholars like that who quote all of the Puranas, they're quoting from a vast array of sacred texts. One wonders, how did they get a hold of it? How did they get a hold of them? It's not like us, you can just go online, or in the old days, you go to a library. So there would have been collections of manuscripts, but they would have been centralized in the courts of kings, perhaps in important temple storehouses. So there would have been these centers which Brahmins would have had access to, and perhaps Vrindavan, perhaps the Goswamis, along with building the temples, they would have, I would imagine, would have been collecting manuscripts and creating sort of manuscript libraries, so to speak. But literacy was not widespread. even to this day in India. Until very recently, and even today, probably many villages cannot read. What to speak of before the advent of the printing press. So yes, India attained amazing levels of erudition, but it was the Brahmin caste, let's be clear about that. It wasn't spread throughout the society. The Brahmins, and certain Brahmins, I don't think all Brahmins would have been necessarily intellectuals, but there were brilliant minds. Some of the best intellectual productions of knowledge have come from Brahminical India, deep philosophical systems, every philosophical view under the sun. Who is the world? Is real? Is it not real? Is it momentary? Is it eternal? I mean, every point of view was debated vigorously between Buddhists and Jains and Vedantins. Very rich literary, the Kavya traditions, astronomy, mathematics, and on and on and on. So without doubt, India, one of the glories of India, the theme of our discussion was its intellectual traditions. But having said that, we should be clear that these traditions were in the preserve of a minute handful, even to this day, traditional Vedanta. It is a enterprise that is conducted by Brahmins. You go down to the Shankara Mats and the Ramanuja centers of learning. It's Brahmanas that are, to this very day, that are conducting the preserving and perpetuating the traditions. So literacy was, as anywhere else in the world, I don't think this was, in medieval Europe, it was just, monks that maybe read and wrote manuscripts and studied the great Christian classics and the church fathers. It would have been monks. And a few elite members of the aristocracy had the means and the leisure to do that, not the vast mass of the population. So that mass learning is a feature of modernity since the Second World War, actually. So yeah, glories of India, definitely literacy, deep moral principles, wonderful aesthetic culture, a lot of which came out of the devotional traditions and temple-based devotional traditions of drama and architecture and cooking. A lot of that emerges from sort of lavish temple activities, dance, Bharatanatyam. Some of these forms emerge from temple communities. So yeah, we can definitely look to those features as wonders of India.
There's a question in the chat. Nadia, can you unmute yourself and that you could ask the question directly?
Sure. It's a question really. It's true what you're saying that literacy was not widespread, but is it not also true that there was a vast oral storytelling tradition? Because I've met a lot of people who could not read or write, but they knew the Bhagavad Gita and these stories that were orally transmitted to them through the storytelling tradition.
Yeah. And that, the Gita perhaps was also a little bit more of a Brahmana text. It was one of the three Vedanta, the Prasthana Traya. But certainly the great stories of the Puranas, the great epics, versions of those and reworkings of those get translated into vernaculars, into folk versions, and they pervade the rural, rustic, and non-literate communities of India. Absolutely. So the stories, which are essentially bhakti stories, not the philosophical tradition. Philosophical traditions would have been in the hands of the Brahmins. Things like Ayurveda and astronomy and those we call them intellectual traditions that require knowledge of Sanskrit because they're preserved in Sanskrit. And it requires, the time to study, right? So if you're a farmer, where do you have the time? Anywhere in the world. Where is it? So the intellectual traditions were in the hands of Brahmins, but the devotional traditions, which essentially center on stories, great stories of Ishvara and the great bhaktas, that's bhakti. Those pervade the subcontinent and take wonderful forms. And that's a whole, if there's a whole still universe of ethnography that remains to be done. If people running around and collecting some of these variants, these different versions of the Mahabharata, different versions of whatever Radha Krishna Leela, they take their own unique forms from one village to another, and in the form of songs and women chanting around the fire as they cooking chapatis, all of this. And so in that sense, bhakti, which means really the great stories of Ishvara and Bhagavan and Bhagavati, the bhakti traditions have pervaded the subcontinent and have transcended their literary origins. They may have been written in Sanskrit by Vyas and Valmiki and the great sages, but from recitation, they then get reworked, and they filter down into every corner, every pocket, every social echelon, every caste will have its sort of special stories that are dear to that community, and the stories are handed down through the generations, and in reality that is Indian culture. The intellectual traditions are elitist culture, scholastic culture. Well, that's a part of India, of course. But in terms of widespread culture, it's really bhakti that, in its infinity of forms. It's infinity of forms. Bhakti, Shiva is worshipped differently from one village to another. Krishna, look at all the different forms of Krishna, Braj Krishna, and then look at Gujarati Krishna and Maharashtra, Krishna in Maharashtra, and then Krishna in Jagannath Puri. I mean, just even Krishna. Look at the variety of ways Krishna is worshipped and represented, and which stories are prioritized and which not. All of this. This behind me, for example, is an Aryan painting from Marissa. You look at which leelas did this artist find important, and so yes, Indian culture then is essentially bhakti. We have bhakti culture that pervades every corner of the subcontinent, and then we have the elite scholastic traditions, just as we have anywhere in the world, just as we have even today. We have elite academic cultures studying, obscure philosophy and high-level science. There's a tiny portion of the population doing that, and then we can have popular science that pervades popular culture. So that's just human civilization.
Professor, I want your opinion on one scholar at Ohio State, Susan Huntington. She wrote an article in The Guardian about India, and she said that her opinion was that the culture of India has sort of sustained without changing more than other cultures like Egypt or Mesopotamia, Persia. She said that certain things like Ayurveda, yoga, ahimsa, something about India's endured more through time than other cultures. Do you think this is true?
I think it's something that's impossible to verify, impossible to document. I mean, how do you prove something like that? I mean, it's kind of like a soundbite. I don't know how you would demonstrate that Indian culture has survived any better than Chinese culture. There's plenty of natural Chinese medicine, and even under a communist regime, it was alive and vibrant, and plenty of indigenous, medicinal forms in Egypt and elsewhere. So I would hesitate, making a statement like that simply because I don't see how you could actually verify it. It's an interesting, it's certainly Indian traditions have been long lived, and now in nouveau riche India, they may very well be making a comeback. Now as India prospers, it's able to invest resources into its traditional kind of knowledge systems, and hopefully that's taking place. But whether that is more than other countries, I don't know how one could demonstrate that. It may be true. I just don't know how you could verify something like that. I'm not denying it. I'm just saying methodologically, I don't see how you could demonstrate that.
It's a very broad.
It's just a very general sort of thing to say. It may have some truth to it, but I don't see how you could substantiate that.
There's stereotypes of Western countries sometimes think of India as a poor place, but India has always been also associated with great wealth. Can you comment on that?
Well, certainly all of the outside, if obviously we have the epics and the Puranas, and they speak of the great wealth of India. But, one could challenge that and say, well, these epics and Puranas are just written by Brahmins, and they just, they flatter the kings, and so they glorify the deeds of the kings. And, so one could challenge that in a Marxist sort of way. But if we look at outsiders, and the first outsiders that wrote about India would have been the Greeks. And after the Greeks, then came Chinese pilgrims coming into India to look for Buddhist texts to bring back to China. So then we had Chinese, and then we had very early Arab travelers, Al-Biruni, and then, of course, the British. And in all of these accounts, we find India associated with great wealth, great learnedness, yes. Very complimentary. The people were gentle. The Greeks would say this, gentle and learned, wise, the gymnosophists. So we do find India associated with great wealth, and that's why people would invade it. That's why the British, colonialized it. That's what colonialization is all about, gaining access to natural resources and wealth and so forth. It was the crown jewel of the British Empire, remember the saying. So yes, historically, India has always been associated with great wealth. Of course, with the British period, then India's natural culture was disrupted. Its rural agricultural culture was disrupted, and urban centers and factories and so forth became a dominant mode of production. And then, of course, that sucked in villages into the workplace, and then, of course, you had urbanization, then we had slums, and you have poverty, and you have all of the things that occurred in England, in Europe at the Industrial Revolution. So India then, of course, went through a period of poverty from the point of view of the world stage. And now, of course, it is there is great energy in India in terms of reestablishing itself as a great presence on the world stage, as a great economic power, as a sort of, and we'll have to see how that plays out. Certainly the middle class has grown enormously, but yet the poor class there's still hundreds of millions that live way, way, way below even the Indian poverty line, what to speak of the Western notions of the poverty line. So we'll have to see how things play out in the next decades. whether some of India's sort of economic and capitalistic wealth can be filtered down into education and other kinds of welfare programs in modern India. But certainly the culture remains thriving at all social levels. The bhakti, various forms of bhakti, pervades every corner of the subcontinent. And there's I have no sense whatsoever. Excuse me. But that bhakti culture is in any way on the decline. Now, moral principles, that may be a different thing, such as, vegetarianism, those sorts of things are on the decline. So there may be a decline on in terms of those kinds of principles, but bhakti is certainly alive and thriving.
I wanted to ask if there's one quote, if Sri Rupa could put the quote about the lilies that fester smell worse than weeds. There's a quote from Shakespeare.
Yeah.
I'd like Sri Rupa to put it on the screen if possible. Can you read that, Sri Rupa? Can you read the quote?
The summer's flower is to the summer sweet, but if that flower with base infection meet, the basest weed outbraves his dignity. For sweetest things turn sourest by their deeds. Lilies that fester smell far worse than weeds. Shakespeare, Sonnet 95.
Yeah. I wanted to ask, it seemed like India is like a rich flower with so many amazing fragrances and qualities. But when the culture is not followed, or like, for instance, Varnashram, there's descriptions of the Brahmins by Europeans that were praising the Brahmins in India. But when the Brahmins are not acting Brahminically, then it seems like even a worse situation. Can you comment on some of the contrasts or the paradoxes of high principles, but sometimes not being followed properly?
Well, yeah, obviously, if high principles can be perverted, and position of Brahman can be seen as a position of power, and therefore those who, without Brahminical qualification, can aspire to that position in order to exert power. But I would say devotees, the business of devotees is to, maybe in some future, who knows, there might be some return to some idyllic social system. But I think the primary concern of devotees should be each and every devotee try to turn him or herself into a pure lover of God, rather than worrying about establishing some anachronistic social system from some previous age that we read about in our idealized epics and Puranas. It seems to me that the main concern of yogis and bhaktas and spiritual representatives in the world today should be leave politics to the politicians and become saintly individuals, because by becoming saintly and pure in the language of our tradition, becoming Mahabhagavatas, aspiring for that, fixing our mind on that goal as individuals, then we will have the charisma, the Shakti, the aura to touch the hearts of others. And in this way, slowly, because after all, society is only made of individuals. There's no point changing social structures. If individuals, the hearts of individuals are worldly and impure, so first the individual has to change, and collectives of individual have to change, and then society will automatically reflect that. So I don't, in my opinion, it's misguided to be directing attention, at least at this point, into changing. That's not the business of devotees to be doing that primarily, trying to change social systems. Our business should be to, first of all, transform ourselves. Otherwise, it's all words, it's all language. We're just parroting sacred text. We should be aspiring to transform ourselves intensely, and then reach out to others. But we wouldn't even need to teach. Our own presences will be transformational. And without transforming our own hearts, our teaching is just words. There's not going to be any seeds planted. So I don't think we should be looking at societal change on a political level. We should be looking simply to spiritualize existing political structures. It doesn't matter whether they're communist, capitalist, whatever they might be. It seems to me our job is not to change them. Certainly not our generation. Maybe 200 years down the road, that might be a different story. But right now, it seems to me our business should be to transform ourselves, especially us oldies, Sarvabhauma, us old devotees. We don't have much time left, my friend. We should be really, really intensely, whatever little we have left of our lives. Enough talk, enough. Just parroting, same old. We have to transform and actually, and that's become that which we read about, that which we preach about. That should be our business. Everything else will follow from that.
I agree totally. I was just saying that India is such a beautiful culture, and when it's followed, the culture is followed properly. I'm not trying to get into politics, but
sure.
I think that people that appreciate Indian culture have some possibility of getting into bhakti.
Of course. But let's keep in mind there's certain aspects of Indian culture that the rest of the world is never going to accept, and such as birth, casteism by birth.
Yeah.
And various other things. So, as you say, there's a paradox there. There's the good, the bad, and the ugly, and certain forms of casteism can be quite ugly. So, again, it seems to me our primary, a task that we should set for ourselves is to become Maha Bhagavatas. That's it.
Easier said than done, but
at least set the intention.
Right on. Hallelujah. I think we could ask if anyone else has questions.
We have 2 questions. Amala Namadas, please unmute yourself and ask your question.
Hare Krishna, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Professor Bryant, about the paradox, I'm in my mid-40s. I grew up in India till 25 years old, but just in the past few years, I found out that India is one of the top exporters of beef. I think it was number 4 last year. So I'm trying to figure out what that means. Is there a real India and then an India we like to think there it is, or what's the reason for that paradox?
Well, yeah, it's kind of what we're saying. That is one of the facets of India. There are multiple Indias. There isn't a generalized, essentialized India. There are a million Indias. And the culture varies from one place to another. So yes, there is this. I don't know where the beef comes from. It must come from Bengal. I think there's only certain states, or there used to be only certain states, Kashmir, Bengal, maybe Kerala, where beef eating, where killing cows was allowed. But I know that they herd them into Pakistan. These huge lines of India, of cows being marched off to wherever it is legal to kill them. So yeah, there isn't, nor was there ever some essentialized one-size-fits-all sort of India. India has an infinity of, when the colonial scholars came to India, they didn't know where to begin. What's the religion even? What are the canonical texts? Westerners were used to thinking of, okay, religion means you have one God, one book, and one prophet. Right? Muhammad, the Quran, Allah, Jesus, Bible, Yahweh. And they get to India and there's an infinity of sacred texts, castes, cultures, communities, geographical variations. So there isn't one India. And there's certainly the beef exporting India and many other types of India. And so we get to choose which aspect of India do we wish to identify with and cultivate. And for someone like myself, it is the yoga India, the India of yoga, and specifically bhakti yoga, and within that specifically Vaishnava yoga, and within that specifically 16th century Gaudiya Vaishnava culture. So that's what India is. That's the India that I'm interested in identifying with, idealizing, pursuing, and propagating in the West. But let's not make the mistake of taking that and then calling that Hinduism. That's a common mistake. People come from some corner of India and think of Hinduism or whatever their experience has been in their little corner, little town, little whatever it is, community here or there. There are a million Indias, a million Hinduisms, a million realities, and we get to choose which one we wish to connect with, idealize, put on a pedestal, structure our lives around. And if you're a teacher, then teach to others. And for people like Sarvabhauma and myself, then that India is the India of the Bhagavata Purana. It's only one little window into India, and many different windows. There's Islamic India. Even within Islamic India, India has the second largest Muslim population in the world after Indonesia. Is that not India? So we need to be, realistic and grounded, and now we're, our head in the clouds about some mythical, whatever, idealized, scripturally represented. You can't universalize that. There's so many Indias. And you've just touched upon one aspect, the fourth largest beef exporting. I didn't know that, actually. I knew it about leather. I knew there was a huge leather industry around Kanpur and places like that. I didn't know beef. So we are, if the Gaudiya Bhaktas, we identify with a particular vein, strain within this multiplex cluster of universes we call Hinduism. We identify with that. And that for us is meaningful. That for us is something that's ideal, that we can look at as an ideal, that we can glorify, right? The glory, glory of India, we can glorify. But we should also be, we shouldn't be naive.
Neelam also has a question. Please unmute and ask your question.
Hare Krishna. I did not have a question, but I was applauding when you were saying we as devotees have to be changing ourselves, that we become automatically the embodiment of that teachings Prabhupada has brought to us. So to me, this is the way I also see it. And when I heard you, I felt very, very, very good. in the past few years, somebody gave me on my birthday your book, Yoga of Patanjali, thinking I would like that. Of course, I like that. But somehow today, seeing you on the screen and connecting the books I read, that one, and there was another from the library I brought, something about Bhagavatam stories. So I just feel very energized listening to you right now. And that tallies with my heartfelt views. I just want you to say that.
Well, thank you. Yes, and I fully agree. You know, instead of looking out there for some glorious, idealized India, we have to become that. What really, if we are to idealize, you know, the India of the yogi, what is it? It's the great beings. It's the great Purusha. It's the great yogis. It's the great teachers. It's the great bhaktas. It's the stories, you know, the Prahlad and Ambarish. These are great personalities. And in all the yoga traditions, we have these great exemplars. They exemplify the tradition. We can become that. They're no different from us. They just set an intention and dedicated themselves to that intention. We can't, you know, we can't push it off on some imagined other. It's we that have to become examples of whatever it is that we feel is beautiful and profound and true in Indian culture. In our case, it's pure bhakti to Sri Krishna. That's our tradition. Other traditions will also have valuable things to offer. But whatever the tradition is, someone has to become that. And why not us? Tell me, why not us? The Atman is the same in all bodies. It's just the mind that makes the decision. I will do it, I will not do it. I can do it, oh no, I can't do it. Or somebody else has to do it. That's weakness. That's uselessness. That's not going to help us at the moment of death. So both if we want to be useful in this world, and if we want to be useful to ourselves at the moment of death, we have to become serious and dedicated, not looking around for others. Sure, nice to have association, of course. Of course, we look for examples, but we have to become that thing. There's no excuse, there's no reason why we cannot. And I'm talking to myself when I say words like that. I'm trying to inspire myself as well. Look, white hair, look at it. Wrinkles. How long have we got, my friends? Not a joke.
I just wanted to thank you. Some of us came on a little late, but Dr. Bryant, he has pretty heavy jet lag from coming back from England, and yet he agreed to be with us and, you know, push himself a little bit. So I appreciate that he's, you know, sharing his heart a little bit in the spirit.
Well, thank you for the invitation, Sarvabhauma Prabhu. My Dandavat Pranam to your service. And your presence as a Vaishnava in full regalia with tilak and shaved head. I offer my pranams to your commitment to the full commitment to the tradition, and I'm sure our paths will cross again.
To my commitment to the externals, but
well, got to start somewhere. My friends, good night.